A healthcare tech worker used a neti pot with bottled water. Her neighbor had the same allergies and used saline spray instead. Same city. Same allergy season. Same sinus pressure. One got better in a week. The other ended up with something eating her brain. 10 days after her morning sinus rinse, Amina Rahman forgot her dog's name. The dog she had lived with for 6 years. The dog who followed her from room to room. The dog who slept beside her bed every night. He stood in front of her, tail wagging, waiting to go outside. And for 3 terrifying seconds, she stared at him like a stranger. Then the name came back. She laughed it off. Everyone forgets things sometimes. At least that is what she told herself. But the headaches had already started. A pressure deep behind her eyes. A fever that came and went. A strange metallic taste she could not explain. And something else. Something far worse. Because while Amina was trying to remember her dog's name, something microscopic was already moving through her brain. Doctors would later discover that the infection had entered through her nose. Not through contaminated food, not through dirty drinking water, not through a wound, through a routine she had performed hundreds of times before. A routine she believed was safe. A routine she thought she had done correctly. And here is the part that will keep you awake tonight. Amina knew the warnings. She never used tap water. She never used lake water. She never used untreated water. She used bottled water. And she still ended up in an intensive care unit fighting one of the deadliest infections known to medicine. And most people who develop it never leave the hospital.
This is Hidden Pathogens.
Amina Rahman was not reckless. That is the first thing you need to understand. She was 38 years old and lived alone in a small apartment outside Miami, Florida. She worked remotely for a healthcare software company. Most days, she barely left the apartment except to walk her dog. Her family lived in other states. Most of her friends were busy with spouses, children, and lives of their own, so her daily routine was simple. Work, prayer, walk the dog, sleep, repeat. The dog, a 6-year-old mixed breed named Cooper, was her constant companion. He greeted her every morning, sat beside her desk while she worked, followed her from room to room as if it were his full-time job. If Amina disappeared behind a closed door, Cooper waited outside until she came back, including the bathroom, especially the bathroom. Because every morning began the same way. Amina had suffered from allergies for most of her adult life. South Florida was beautiful. It was also full of pollen, mold, humidity, and things that seemed determined to clog her sinuses year-round. She had tried everything: antihistamines, decongestants, prescription sprays, humidifiers, air purifiers. Some helped, most did not. Then a doctor recommended a neti pot. The difference was immediate. Within days, she could breathe through her nose again. The headaches eased. The pressure behind her eyes disappeared. For the first time in years, she felt normal. So the neti pot became part of her routine, every morning, without fail. The routine was so automatic that she could have performed it with her eyes closed. And unlike many people who use neti pots, Amina actually paid attention to the warnings. She had read every instruction, every recommendation, every safety guideline. She knew about the rare infections. She knew about contaminated water. She knew about the horror stories that occasionally appeared in the news. Which is why she followed the rules, religiously. She never filled the neti pot from the bathroom sink. Never used water from the kitchen faucet. Never used water from a filter pitcher. Never took shortcuts. She never used tap water, ever. Instead, she bought bottled water specifically for her morning rinses. She kept unopened bottles in a cabinet above the stove. Every morning she grabbed one, filled the neti pot, and assumed she was doing exactly what she was supposed to do. And for years, nothing happened. No infections, no complications, no warning signs. Just another safe morning routine. Until one morning, it wasn't. And by the time Amina realized something was wrong, the organism had already entered her body. The neti pot wasn't the mistake. The water was. Amina did not ignore the warnings. She followed them. That is what makes this story different. Most people who hear about brain-eating amoebas imagine someone swimming in a warm lake, diving into a pond, jumping into contaminated water. They imagine someone taking a risk. Amina wasn't taking a risk. She was trying to avoid one. Years earlier, she had read an article about a woman who developed a fatal infection after using tap water in a neti pot. The story terrified her, so she researched. She read health advisories, medical websites, product instructions. Every source seemed to repeat the same message. Never use tap water. Never use lake water. Never use untreated water. Use distilled, sterile, or properly treated water instead. Amina remembered the first part. Never use tap water. That warning stuck in her mind. And from that day forward, she treated her bathroom sink like it was contaminated. Friends teased her about it. Co-workers thought she was overly cautious. She did not care. Every week she bought packs of bottled water from the grocery store. The bottles stayed in a cabinet reserved for one purpose, the neti pot. Nothing else. She believed she was being safer than most people, and in many ways, she was. The problem was not what she knew. The problem was what she didn't know, because bottled water and sterile water are not the same thing. Read that again. Bottled water and sterile water are not the same thing. Most people assume they are. Amina certainly did. If water was clean enough to drink, surely it was clean enough for a neti pot. That assumption feels logical. It feels obvious. And it is exactly where the danger hides. When you drink water, your stomach acid destroys countless microorganisms. Your digestive system is built for that battle. Your nasal passages are different. The nose leads directly toward structures connected to the brain. That is why water that is perfectly safe to swallow may not be considered safe for nasal rinsing. Amina never understood that distinction. Neither do most people. Every morning she opened a bottle, filled the neti pot, rinsed her sinuses, and went on with her day. Nothing happened. Then nothing happened again, and again. Hundreds of rinses, hundreds of normal mornings, which only reinforced her confidence. The routine felt proven, safe, reliable. Routine has a way of disguising danger. The more often something works, the less likely you are to question it. And that is exactly where Amina found herself. Standing in the bathroom on an ordinary Miami morning. Cooper waiting outside the door, the neti pot in her hand. Completely convinced she was doing everything right. What she didn't know was that one tiny mistake had already slipped through every precaution she thought was protecting her, and it was about to begin a journey toward the most vulnerable organ in her body. The morning that changed everything did not feel different. There was no warning, no strange smell, no unusual taste, no sign that anything was wrong. It began exactly like hundreds of mornings before it. Amina woke up just after sunrise, performed her morning prayer, clipped Cooper's leash to his collar and took him outside for a short walk around the apartment complex. The Florida air was already warm. By the time they returned, her allergies were acting up. Her nose felt congested. The familiar pressure was building behind her eyes. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming, just another allergy morning in Miami. Cooper wandered into the kitchen while Amina opened a fresh bottle of water. She poured it into the neti pot, twisted the cap back onto the bottle, then walked toward the bathroom. As always, Cooper followed. He stopped outside the bathroom door while she stepped inside. The ritual never changed. Tilt head, insert spout, breathe through the mouth. Let the water flow. One side, then the other. A few seconds later, it was over. The congestion eased almost immediately. The pressure in her sinuses disappeared. Relief, just like always. She rinsed the neti pot, wiped down the counter, opened the bathroom door. Cooper was waiting exactly where he always waited. His tail thumped against the wall as she stepped out. She smiled, scratched behind his ears, then moved on with the rest of her day. Emails, video meetings, lunch, more work, nothing happened. Or the day after that. Because infections like this do not announce themselves. They hide. They move quietly, patiently. And while Amina answered emails and walked her dog and lived her normal life, something else was happening inside her body. When the rinse was finished, not all of the water drained away. A few drops remained deep inside her nasal passages. That is completely normal. It happens every time someone uses a neti pot. Most people never think about it. Amina certainly didn't. Why would she? The rinse was over. The water was gone. The day had moved on. But a few drops remained, and inside those drops was something no human eye could see. Not a bacterium. Not a virus. Not a parasite. Something far rarer. A single-celled organism that had survived for millions of years. An organism that spends most of its existence feeding on bacteria in warm water. An organism that almost never encounters humans. But when it does, and when it enters through the nose instead of the mouth, it can begin one of the deadliest infections known to medicine. At that moment, Amina felt completely healthy. She had no idea that anything had entered her body. No idea that the organism had already found the moist tissue lining her nasal cavity. No idea that it was beginning a journey that would end inside her brain. And by the time the first symptom appeared, it would already be too late to stop that journey. The only question left was whether anyone would recognize what was happening before it killed her. The organism that entered Amina's nose has a name most doctors will never encounter during their careers. Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. The name sounds like something invented for a horror movie. Unfortunately, it is real. And what makes it terrifying is not how common it is. It is how rare it is. Across the United States, only a handful of infections are reported over decades. Most people will never meet someone who has had it. Most emergency physicians will never diagnose a case. Most hospitals will never see one. But when infection does happen, the outcome is usually catastrophic. The fatality rate exceeds 95%. And that number has remained stubbornly high for decades. Here is why. Naegleria fowleri does not infect people the way most organisms do. You cannot catch it from a sick person. You cannot spread it by coughing. You cannot become infected by drinking contaminated water. The organism has only one route that matters: the nose. That is why swimming accidents and nasal rinsing accidents appear again and again in the medical literature. The amoeba enters the nasal cavity. Then it finds something most people do not even realize exists: the olfactory nerves. These nerves are responsible for smell. Every time you catch the scent of coffee, perfume, smoke, or rain, those signals travel through the olfactory system into the brain. Normally, the pathway works in one direction. Information travels inward, but Naegleria fowleri uses the same route like a highway. Once inside the nose, it begins moving upward, past the protective lining, toward the tiny nerve fibers that connect directly to the brain, millimeter by millimeter, cell by cell. The journey takes time, days, sometimes longer, which creates a dangerous illusion. The victim feels normal, works, sleeps, exercises, goes shopping, walks the dog, lives life exactly as before. Meanwhile, something is climbing toward the most important organ in the body. And this is the part that matters. It wasn't eating her brain yet. It was traveling toward it. While Amina attended virtual meetings, while she answered emails, while Cooper slept beside her desk, the amoeba continued moving. Invisible, silent, undetected. Eventually it reached the thin layer of tissue separating the olfactory nerves from the brain itself. And then the invasion truly began. Because once Naegleria fowleri enters brain tissue, the danger is no longer the organism alone. It is the war that follows. The amoeba damages cells as it spreads. The immune system notices. White blood cells rush in. Inflammation explodes. Pressure begins building inside the skull. The brain starts swelling inside a space that cannot expand. And that is where most victims lose the battle. Not because the amoeba is large, not because there are thousands of them, but because the body's attempt to stop the infection can become almost as destructive as the infection itself. Amina had no way of knowing any of this. She was still living her normal routine, still walking Cooper every morning, still using the same computer, still sleeping in the same bed, completely unaware that a microscopic organism had already reached the edge of her brain. The countdown had started. She just couldn't hear it. 10 days after the morning rinse, Amina woke up with a headache. Not the worst headache of her life, not even close, just a dull pressure behind her eyes. The kind of headache allergy sufferers get all the time. She barely thought about it. Miami's allergy season had been brutal that year. A headache was hardly surprising. By lunchtime, the headache was worse. The pressure felt deeper. Less like a headache. More like something pushing from the inside. She took ibuprofen. The pain faded, then came back. The next morning she woke up feeling cold. Not air conditioning cold, sick cold. When she checked her temperature, she had a fever. 100 degrees. Nothing alarming. Just enough to make her feel exhausted. She canceled a video meeting and spent the afternoon working from the couch. Cooper stayed beside her the entire time. Every few hours he would lift his head and stare at her, as if he could tell something was different. By day 12, the nausea started. Food lost its appeal. The smell of coffee made her stomach turn. She forced herself to eat a few crackers, then went back to bed. The symptoms still made sense. Headache, fever, nausea. Millions of people experience those symptoms every year. Flu, sinus infection, migraine, take your pick. Nobody hears those symptoms and thinks, brain-eating amoeba. Not in Miami. Not in a woman who had never gone swimming. Not in someone who had been sitting at home working remotely. And certainly not in someone who was careful. Amina wasn't worried. She planned to call her doctor if she wasn't feeling better by the weekend. Then something happened that she couldn't explain. That evening, Cooper trotted into the living room carrying his leash. It was their routine. Every night at 6, he brought the leash. She clipped it on. They went for a walk. The dog dropped the leash at her feet and looked up expectantly. Amina smiled, reached down, and froze. For a moment, she couldn't remember his name. Not a nickname, not a command. His name. She stared at him. The dog she had lived with for 6 years. The dog who followed her everywhere. The dog who slept beside her bed every night. Nothing. Her mind was blank. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then it came back. Cooper, of course. His name was Cooper. She laughed nervously and shook her head. Everyone forgets things. People lose words all the time, especially when they're sick. But as Cooper wagged his tail and waited for his walk, a strange feeling settled in her stomach. The headache, the fever, the nausea, and now this. For the first time, Amina wondered if something more serious was happening. What she didn't know was that this wasn't ordinary forgetfulness. It wasn't stress. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't the flu. The infection had reached her brain, and the symptoms were about to become impossible to ignore. The next morning, Amina did not log in to work. That had never happened before. Not without calling. Not without sending a message. Not without an explanation. She simply sat at the kitchen table staring at her laptop. The screen was open. The password box was waiting, and for several seconds, she could not remember the password she had typed every weekday for the past 4 years. Eventually it came back. But something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. The headache had changed. It was no longer sitting behind her eyes. Now it seemed to fill her entire head. A constant pressure, heavy, relentless, as if her skull had become too small for her brain. Then came the light. The sunlight spilling through her apartment windows felt unbearable. She closed the blinds, turned off the television, dimmed every lamp she could find. Even the glow from her computer screen hurt. Cooper watched her move from room to room. The behavior made no sense. Normally she opened the curtains every morning. Normally she liked sunlight. Today she was hiding from it. By afternoon, the nausea became vomiting. At first it was once, then twice, then 3 times. Each episode left her weaker, more exhausted, more confused. She tried to drink water. Most of it came back up. Her body was fighting a battle she didn't understand. Inside her skull, the infection was triggering inflammation. Brain tissue was swelling. Pressure was building. And the symptoms were accelerating. That evening, Cooper brought her the leash again. 6 o'clock. Right on schedule, the same routine they had followed for years. Amina looked down at the leash, then at the dog. For several seconds, she seemed confused about what he wanted. Cooper tilted his head, waiting. Nothing happened. Eventually he nudged the leash against her leg. Still nothing. Amina just stared at him. Not frightened, not angry. Just absent. Like her mind was somewhere else. That was when Cooper began following her everywhere, closer than usual. If she stood up, he stood up. If she walked into another room, he followed. If she sat down, he lay at her feet, watching, waiting. Something about her behavior had changed. Animals notice routines. And Amina's routine was disappearing. Later that night, she wandered into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. She stood there for nearly a minute, not reaching for anything, not eating, just staring into the light. When she finally closed the door, she seemed surprised to find herself standing there. The confusion was getting worse. The infection was affecting parts of the brain responsible for memory, attention, and judgment. But Amina didn't know that. She only knew that she felt strange, very strange. And somewhere beneath the headache and nausea, a quiet fear was beginning to grow. Around midnight, she got up to use the bathroom. Halfway down the hallway, she lost her balance and grabbed the wall. The room tilted. Just for a second. Then it stopped. She stood perfectly still, heart racing, trying to understand what had just happened. Behind her, Cooper was already on his feet, watching. The dog had no idea what a brain-eating amoeba was. He didn't understand inflammation. He didn't understand infection. He didn't understand that something microscopic was attacking the person who fed him and cared for him every day. But he understood one thing. Something was wrong with Amina, and by morning, it would be impossible to pretend otherwise. By the next morning, Amina could barely stand. The headache was unbearable. The light sensitivity was worse. Every movement made the nausea surge. Even Cooper seemed nervous. He paced between the bedroom and the front door, whining softly, following her every step. Amina tried to convince herself she just needed rest. But when she nearly fell again while walking to the bathroom, she finally admitted something was seriously wrong. She called a rideshare, left extra food and water for Cooper, and headed to the emergency room. It was the first time she had spent a night away from him in years. The ER was busy. Flu cases, broken bones, chest pain, the usual parade of emergencies. Amina sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, holding her head in her hands. When the triage nurse checked her temperature, the fever had climbed again. Her blood pressure was elevated, her heart rate was fast, and her symptoms were getting worse by the hour. Headache, fever, vomiting, confusion, light sensitivity. The emergency physician reviewed the chart and immediately focused on the most likely explanation: meningitis. It fit, the symptoms matched. And unlike a brain-eating amoeba, meningitis is something emergency doctors encounter regularly. The physician entered the room and began asking questions. When did the symptoms start? Had anyone around her been sick? Any recent infections? Any neck stiffness? Amina answered as best she could. The doctor listened carefully, then moved on to another set of questions. Questions designed to uncover unusual causes. Had she traveled recently? No. Any international trips? No. Any camping? No. Any exposure to sick animals? No. The doctor paused. Most of the obvious answers were disappearing. Then came another question. Had she been swimming recently? Amina shook her head. No pools, no beaches, No lakes, no rivers, nothing. The physician frowned. Many rare infections are linked to water exposure. But without swimming, those possibilities seemed less likely. Then another question. Any freshwater exposure? Again, no. The doctor looked back at the chart. Something still wasn't fitting. The symptoms were severe. The progression was fast, yet none of the usual risk factors were present. Then the physician asked one final question. A question that almost seemed unrelated. Do you use a neti pot or any kind of nasal rinse? Amina blinked. Every morning. The doctor looked up. What kind of water do you use? Bottled water. The answer seemed to reassure everyone in the room, even Amina. After all, she had never used tap water. Never. She had followed the safety warnings. She had been careful. But the physician didn't move on. Instead, something about the answer seemed to catch his attention. Most people would have stopped there. Bottled water sounds safe. Case closed. This doctor kept thinking. Because there was a difference between bottled water and sterile water, and in rare cases, that difference could mean everything. A few minutes later, the physician stepped into the hallway and made a phone call. Then another. Then another. Inside the room, Amina sat quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. She had no idea that a single question about a neti pot had just changed the entire direction of her case, and possibly saved her life. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And, if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Let's continue. The emergency physician's name was Dr. Michael Torres. He had worked emergency medicine for nearly 12 years. During that time, he had diagnosed strokes, heart attacks, meningitis, brain tumors, sepsis, and diseases most people had never heard of. But he had never personally treated a case of Naegleria Fowleri. Not once. What he did have was a habit. When something didn't fit, he kept asking questions. Most diagnoses happen because doctors recognize patterns. The danger is that unusual diseases often arrive disguised as ordinary ones. Amina's symptoms looked like meningitis, the fever, the headache, the vomiting, the confusion, the light sensitivity. Everything pointed in that direction. But there was something bothering him. The timeline, the speed, the strange memory lapses, and the fact that she had no obvious source of infection. Then there was the neti pot. Back in the exam room, he asked the question again. What kind of water did you use? Amina looked confused. Bottled water? Dr. Torres nodded. Amina added something she had already told several people. I never use tap water. The room became quiet. Most doctors would have moved on. Bottled water sounds safe. Case closed. But Dr. Torres didn't move on. Instead, he asked another question. Distilled water? Amina hesitated. I don't think so. Sterile water? I don't know. What brand? Amina told him. The doctor nodded slowly. Then he sat back in his chair, thinking. Because there was an important distinction most people never learn. Water can be safe to drink, and still not be considered sterile. Safe and sterile are not the same thing. The difference rarely matters. Until it matters a lot. Torres remembered reading about a handful of unusual infections years earlier. Rare cases. Extremely rare. The kind of diseases most physicians only encounter in medical journals. He wasn't convinced that was what he was looking at. In fact, he hoped it wasn't. Because if he was right, Amina's situation had just become much more dangerous. He stepped into the hallway and pulled up her chart. Female. 38. Previously healthy. Rapidly worsening neurological symptoms. Recent nasal irrigation. Possible non-sterile water exposure. The pieces didn't fit perfectly. But they fit enough. Enough to make him uncomfortable. Enough to make him pick up the phone. A few minutes later, an infectious disease specialist was reviewing the case. Then a neurologist. Then, a laboratory supervisor. The hospital began moving faster, not because anyone knew the answer, because one physician refused to ignore a question that seemed insignificant. Inside the examination room, Amina's headache continued to worsen. The pressure behind her eyes was becoming unbearable. She could hear staff moving through the hallway, phones ringing, doors opening and closing, conversations she couldn't quite follow. She assumed they were looking for evidence of meningitis. She assumed they were trying to rule out a stroke. She assumed this was routine. It wasn't. Behind the scenes, a small group of doctors had begun considering a diagnosis that almost nobody survives. And if they were going to save her life, they had very little time left. Because somewhere inside Amina's brain, the infection was no longer traveling. It had arrived. This is the moment that saved Amina's life. Not the medication, not the ICU, not the specialists. This moment, the question. Most doctors know that neti pots can be linked to rare infections. Most doctors also know those infections are incredibly uncommon. So uncommon that many physicians will go their entire careers without seeing one. That is why the answer bottled water usually ends the conversation. The risk seems gone, case closed. But Dr. Torres kept thinking about something he had learned years earlier. Bottled water is packaged for drinking. Sterile water is prepared for medical use. Those are not the same thing. Most of the time, the distinction doesn't matter. Today, it might matter more than anything. The more he reviewed Amina's symptoms, the less comfortable he became. Rapid neurological decline, severe headache, fever, vomiting, confusion, recent nasal irrigation. The pattern was beginning to emerge. Not clearly, not definitively, but enough. Enough to act. And acting early was the only chance she had. Because Naegleria fowleri has a cruel advantage. By the time doctors are certain, the patient is often dying. Confirmation arrives after the damage is done, after the swelling, after the coma, after the point where treatment can make a difference. Dr. Torres had no intention of waiting that long. He immediately contacted the infectious disease team, then neurology, then the laboratory. The requests he made were unusual. Urgent cerebrospinal fluid analysis, special microscopic examination, testing designed to look for organisms that almost nobody expects to find. The laboratory staff understood the implication immediately. The room became very quiet. Meanwhile, Amina was moved for additional imaging. Her headache continued to worsen. The pressure inside her skull was building. Every hour mattered. Every minute mattered. And then Dr. Torres made the decision that changed everything. He started treatment before confirmation. That might sound reckless. It wasn't. It was the opposite. Because if the diagnosis was correct, waiting for proof could kill her. The medications carried risks. The diagnosis was uncertain. But the disease they were trying to stop was far worse. So the first doses were ordered. Not because they knew. Because they suspected. Because one physician looked at a collection of ordinary symptoms and saw something extraordinary hiding underneath. Hours passed. Specialists reviewed scans. Lab technicians examined samples. Phone calls crossed departments. Amina drifted in and out of sleep, completely unaware that a race had begun around her. The doctors were racing the infection. The infection was racing her immune system. And somewhere in the middle sat a single question about a neti pot. A question that almost nobody else would have asked. Most patients with Naegleria fowleri are diagnosed after the amoeba has already won. Amina was different. For the first time since her symptoms began, the infection was no longer moving faster than the people trying to stop it. Now the question was whether they had caught it in time. The answer was sitting in a laboratory microscope, and everyone was waiting for the call. The call came late that evening. A laboratory technician had been examining Amina's cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. Most samples reveal nothing unusual. Bacteria, white blood cells, signs of inflammation, routine findings. This sample was different. Under the microscope, something was moving, not drifting, not floating, moving. The technician adjusted the focus, looked again, then called a supervisor. Minutes later, multiple people were staring at the same slide. Nobody in the room was smiling, because they all knew what they were looking at. The result was immediately escalated. A phone rang in the infectious disease department. Another rang in the emergency department. Then another in the intensive care unit. The diagnosis was no longer a suspicion. It was confirmed. Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. For a few moments nobody spoke. Not because they were surprised. Because they understood what the diagnosis meant. Every physician involved in the case knew the statistics. They knew how these stories usually ended. The amoeba enters through the nose, migrates into the brain, triggers overwhelming inflammation. The patient deteriorates rapidly. Then comes the coma. Then, in most cases, death. The entire process can unfold in days, sometimes less than a week. That is what makes the disease so terrifying. Not just its lethality, its speed. Most fatal infections give doctors time. This one often doesn't. Torres received the confirmation and immediately reviewed Amina's chart. For the first time all day, he allowed himself a small sense of relief. Not because the diagnosis was good, it was terrible, but because treatment had already begun, hours earlier. Before the laboratory confirmation, before the official result, before the infection had reached its most destructive stage. That decision might have changed everything. Meanwhile, Amina was getting worse. The headache was now almost impossible to describe. Light felt like knives behind her eyes. The confusion came in waves. One moment she understood where she was, the next moment she didn't. When a nurse asked her what day it was, she answered correctly. When asked again 20 minutes later, she couldn't remember. The swelling inside her brain was increasing. The war had begun. And now everyone knew the enemy. News of the diagnosis spread through the hospital. Neurology, infectious disease, critical care. Each specialist understood the same thing. This was no longer an ordinary medical case. It was a fight against one of the deadliest infections in modern medicine. Back at Amina's apartment, Cooper had no idea any of this was happening. A neighbor had agreed to care for him temporarily. But every evening he returned to Amina's front door, waiting, watching, listening, expecting her to come home. Instead, she was lying in a hospital bed, while teams of doctors prepared for the next phase of the battle. Because identifying the amoeba was only the beginning. Now came the harder question. How do you save someone from a disease that almost nobody survives? And why do more than 95% of patients die even after doctors know exactly what they're fighting? That answer was waiting in the intensive care unit, and it was far more frightening than the diagnosis itself. 2. Understand why everyone became so serious after the diagnosis. You need to understand the numbers. Naegleria fowleri is not one of the deadliest infections in medicine. It is one of the deadliest diagnoses. There is a difference. Many dangerous diseases kill because treatment does not exist. Treatment for Naegleria does exist. The problem is timing. By the time doctors realize what they are dealing with, the infection has usually been attacking the brain for days, and the brain does not tolerate delays. Since the infection was first identified, more than 95% of patients have died. Think about that for a moment. Not 50%, not 70%, not even 90%, more than 95%. Imagine a room containing 20 patients. Statistically, 19 of them do not survive. Sometimes all 20 die. That is the reality doctors face when they hear the words Naegleria fowleri. And the fatality rate is not high because physicians are careless. It is high because the disease is a master of disguise. The early symptoms look ordinary. Headache, fever, nausea, vomiting. Every emergency department in America sees those complaints every single day. Doctors think about migraines, flu, meningitis, COVID, food poisoning. Countless possibilities. Brain-eating amoeba sits near the very bottom of the list. If it appears on the list at all, that delay is often fatal. By the time the correct diagnosis is made, the infection has already caused catastrophic swelling inside the skull. Patients arrive confused, disoriented, sometimes hallucinating, sometimes having seizures. Some are already unconscious. Many never wake up. The disease moves so quickly that doctors are often racing damage that has already happened. And once enough brain tissue is injured, there is no medication on earth that can reverse it. That is why survival stories are so rare. Not because doctors don't know how to treat the infection, because they usually meet the patient too late. Amina's physicians knew all of this. Every statistic, every case report, every tragic outcome. They had seen the photographs, read the journals, studied the stories. Healthy people, children, college students, parents, people who had gone swimming, people who had used nasal rinses, people who had no idea they were in danger until it was far too late. Most of them followed the same pattern. Diagnosis, rapid decline, death. The timeline was horrifyingly predictable, which is why nobody in the ICU was celebrating the positive test. Confirmation did not mean victory. It meant the real fight was beginning. Amina had one advantage that many victims never get: time. Not much, but some. The infection had been recognized before she slipped into a coma, before seizures began, before severe neurological damage became obvious. That tiny window was the reason she was still conscious, the reason she could still answer questions, the reason she still knew who she was. But the window was closing. Even with treatment, nobody could guarantee what would happen next. The medications needed time to work. The infection was already inside her brain, and the swelling could become deadly long before the amoeba was eliminated. That night, doctors monitored her constantly, checking her pupils, her memory, her reflexes, watching for signs that pressure inside her skull was increasing, watching for evidence that the disease was winning. Outside the hospital, the city carried on as normal. Cars moved through Miami traffic. Restaurants filled with customers. People walked dogs along the sidewalks. Most had never heard of Naegleria fowleri. Most never would. And if you had walked past Amina's hospital room that night, you would have seen something that looked almost ordinary. A woman lying quietly in bed. Machines humming softly around her. Nurses moving in and out. Nothing dramatic, nothing frightening, but appearances can be deceptive. Because statistically speaking, Amina Rahman should already have been dying, and according to everything medicine knew about this infection, there was every reason to believe she still might. The next 48 hours would decide whether she became another fatal case, or something much rarer, a survivor. The intensive care unit is where medicine fights its hardest battles. Not because the doctors are smarter there, not because the equipment is better, because the margin for error disappears, and Amina had no margin left. By midnight, she had been transferred to the ICU. the diagnosis was confirmed. The infection was advancing. And nobody knew whether treatment had started early enough. A team of specialists gathered around her case. Infectious disease, neurology, critical care, pharmacy. Every hour brought new discussions, new decisions, new risks. Because treating Naegleria fowleri is unlike treating almost any other infection. There is no single miracle drug, no guaranteed cure, no treatment that doctors can confidently point to and say, this will work. Instead, physicians attack from every direction at once. Multiple medications, aggressive monitoring, constant adjustments. The goal is simple. Keep the patient alive long enough for the treatment to work. That sounds straightforward. It isn't. Because the amoeba was only part of the problem. The swelling was becoming just as dangerous. Every infection triggers an immune response. Normally that's a good thing, but the brain sits inside a rigid skull. There is nowhere for swelling to go. As inflammation increases, pressure rises. And when pressure rises inside the skull, healthy brain tissue begins to suffer. Too much swelling can damage memory, vision, speech, movement. Enough swelling can stop breathing entirely. The monitors around Amina's bed tracked everything. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen levels, neurological status. Nurses checked on her constantly. Flashlight in the eyes, simple questions. Memory tests, orientation checks. What is your name? Where are you? What year is it? At first she answered correctly, then sometimes she hesitated, a second longer, then two. The delays worried everyone. The infection was still active. The swelling was still increasing, and nobody knew where the tipping point was. Back at the apartment, Cooper waited near the front door. The neighbor caring for him tried taking him home. The dog refused. He kept returning to Amina's apartment, lying outside the door, watching the hallway, waiting for footsteps that never came. Meanwhile, inside the ICU, the atmosphere was tense. Not dramatic, not chaotic, quiet. The kind of quiet that exists when everyone understands the stakes. One nurse later described it as a room holding its breath. Because everyone knew the statistics. Everyone knew how these stories usually ended. The patient gets worse, then worse again. Then comes the moment where doctors realize they are no longer trying to save a life. They are trying to delay a death. Nobody said it aloud, but the possibility hung over every conversation, every treatment decision, every neurological exam. Then, sometime during the second night, something changed, not dramatically, not all at once. Amina's condition stopped worsening. The pressure markers stabilized. The fever stopped climbing. The neurological exams stopped deteriorating. For the first time since her arrival, doctors weren't watching her decline. They were watching her hold the line. That wasn't victory, not even close. But in a disease where patients often deteriorate hour by hour, simply not getting worse felt significant. Still, nobody was celebrating, not yet. The infection had fooled people before. Patients sometimes appear stable right before a catastrophic decline. The team remained cautious, careful, waiting, watching, hoping. Because somewhere inside Amina's brain, a battle was taking place that no monitor could fully measure. The medications were attacking the amoeba. The immune system was attacking the infection, and the swelling was threatening both sides. The next 24 hours would reveal which force was winning. For the first time since entering the hospital, there was a reason to hope. But hope and survival are not the same thing. Not when you're fighting one of the deadliest infections on Earth. By the fourth day in the ICU, something changed that nobody in the room had fully allowed themselves to expect. Amina opened her eyes and stayed awake, not briefly, not in a confused half-state, but fully, alert, for the first time in days. The nurse asked her name. She answered correctly. She asked where she was. Amina paused, then said, hospital. Then she added something that made the room go quiet. My head doesn't hurt as much. It was not a dramatic moment. No alarms, no sudden celebration. Just a quiet shift in the direction everyone had been hoping for, but not daring to predict. The swelling markers on her scans had started to stabilize. Not gone, not resolved, but no longer worsening. The aggressive treatment regimen was still running through her IV lines. Multiple drugs working at once. Some targeting the organism itself, others controlling inflammation, others protecting her brain from the collateral damage of the immune response. It was a balancing act more than a cure. But for the first time, the balance was holding. Doctors reviewed the latest imaging results twice, then a third time. The radiologist didn't change the report, but the tone in the room changed anyway, because the brain swelling that had been expanding day by day was no longer progressing at the same pace. Amina was still critically ill, still at risk, still not out of danger, but she was no longer moving in the direction of death, and in cases like this, that shift is everything. On the fifth day, she was able to recognize the nurse who had been assigned to her since admission. On the sixth day, she asked for water on her own. On the 7th day, she remembered Cooper. That moment broke something in the room. Not loudly, but emotionally, because it meant she was still her. The infection had not erased her identity. It had not taken everything. Outside the ICU, Cooper was finally allowed to visit the hospital courtyard with the neighbor. He sat down the moment they reached the entrance and refused to move closer, as if he knew, as if he understood that the place behind those doors was where she was, but not where he could reach her. Inside, Amina's condition continued to slowly improve. The fever resolved, the nausea faded, the headaches became intermittent instead of constant. The doctors remained cautious. They had seen late declines before. They had seen patients stabilize and then crash. So every improvement was measured, every positive sign double-checked. But the trend was no longer in the wrong direction. By the end of the 2nd week, Amina was sitting up in bed, weak, tired, confused at times, but awake, alive. The infectious disease specialist stood at the foot of her bed one afternoon, reviewing her latest labs. Then he looked up and said something that no one had expected to hear when this case began. "She's responding." It was not a declaration of victory, it was not a discharge plan, but it was the first time the word responding had entered her case. And in infections like Naegleria Fowleri, that word almost never appears. Most patients never reach this point. Most never leave the ICU. Most never wake up again after neurological decline begins. Amina did, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, she was coming back. There were still risks ahead. Seizures, long-term neurological effects, relapse of inflammation, rehabilitation that could take months, even years. But the immediate crisis, the one that usually ends these stories, was passing. And for the first time since the morning she used her Neti pot, Amina was no longer being measured in chances of survival. She was being measured in recovery. Somewhere outside the hospital, Cooper finally stopped waiting at the door every night. Not because he forgot, but because, for the first time in a long time, something in the rhythm of the world had begun to change. And inside the ICU, the doctors finally allowed themselves to acknowledge what they had been working toward all along. She was going to live. She used a Neti pot with bottled water. Her neighbor had the same allergies and used saline spray instead. Same city, same allergy season, same sinus pressure. One got better in a week. The other ended up fighting something that almost never loses. A brain-eating amoeba. Most patients never make it past the ICU. Amina Rahman did. But not because the infection was mild. And not because the risk wasn't real. It was real. It was severe. And it was already inside her brain before anyone realized what was happening. What changed everything was not luck. It was time. Just enough time for one doctor to ask one question. What kind of water did you use? Just enough time for Amina to answer something most people would have thought was perfectly safe. Bottled water. I never use tap water. Just enough time for that answer not to end the investigation, but to begin it. Because bottled water and sterile water are not the same thing. And that small distinction is often invisible until it is not. By the time the diagnosis was confirmed, the infection had already reached the most dangerous stage. But treatment had already started. Before confirmation. Before certainty. Before it was too late. That decision is what changed the outcome. In most cases, Naegleria Fowleri is only recognized after the brain is already failing. After seizures begin. After coma sets in. After the damage is irreversible. Amina never reached that point. She was treated in the narrow window between infection and collapse, and she survived. Weeks later, when she finally left the hospital, she was weak. Relearning strength, rebuilding memory, adjusting to a body that had been through something it barely understood, but she was alive, and Cooper was waiting. He didn't hesitate when he saw her. He didn't need time to recognize her. He simply ran. And for the first time in weeks, Amina knelt down and said his name without thinking. Cooper. This is not a story about fear. It is a story about timing. About how something microscopic can enter a human body through something as ordinary as a morning routine. And how survival sometimes depends on a single question asked at the right moment. Same city, same routine, same water choices. One outcome almost always ends the same way. But not this time. This time, a diagnosis arrived early enough to matter. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. And if you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is hidden pathogens?